Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the honor to moderate this first session. The theme is the emerging governance of the Energy Union. Governance is crucial for any project, yes? It decides on its efficiency, it decides whether the goals will be achieved and whether the stakeholders all work in the same direction. And in the case of the Energy Union, this is a tricky issue. Why? Because the Energy Union spans 5 dimensions, from security of supply to internal market, to energy efficiency, climate, and research. And you have different targets, sometimes quantitative, sometimes more political, sometimes binding on the EU, on the member states, sometimes less binding, and you discussed it yesterday, which all need to be intertwined in this governance system. So the Energy Union governance should integrate those dimensions, both in terms of policy, and you have here the climate and energy policy, which need to be, I would say, not for the first time, because there were already attempts, but they need to be really integrated together. And you also need more integration in terms of geography, in terms of cooperation between the member states, between authorities in different countries. So at the end of the day, all this needs to work together. You need to bring more coherence, to bring more predictability for investors. Now, let me make 2 caveats in these introductory remarks. The first one is that when governance is discussed in Brussels, for example, by the Council of the EU, they focus on something, I would say, more narrow than what we have in mind. They focus on strategic planning, integration of the strategic planning, on the integration of monitoring and reporting obligations. This is very important. Why? Because, for example, I read in the papers, in the Commission paper, that only 1/3 of the member states have strategies for climate and energy going beyond 2020. We have 2030 framework. We are discussing how to divide the burden, but only 1/3 of the member states have the strategies looking forward to 2030. And the second point is that I understand there are around 70 reporting, monitoring obligations on the member states at different levels currently. So very clearly the system needs to be streamlined. And I exclude the obligations on the Commission, which are, I think, around 50 as well altogether. So, because we are not in Brussels, and we are lucky not to be in Brussels because I hear it's raining again, we will not focus on this narrow perspective. We will look further, we will look to the role of the institutions. And both these aspects, in fact, the strategic planning, reporting and monitoring, and the role of the institutions will be addressed in the upcoming legislative proposals by the Commission by the end of this year. The second caveat is that we will not be able to cover the whole ground of governance of the Energy Union, and this is, as per the title of the session, this is the emerging governance, so we won't be able to dot the I's and cross the T's, but we will have 3 presentations here. The first presentation will take a look at governance from the perspective of the upcoming proposal on the new electricity market design. And then we'll have 2 presentations concerning the role of the Agency for Cooperation of the Energy Regulators, taking slightly different views. So I will now pass the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Riechmann. Mr. Riechmann has extensive, over 20 years experience in consulting and research for the energy sector. And he's a director at Frontier Economics, a consultancy. Please.
Yes, thank you. I think I can actually use the other microphone. I have the opportunity now to focus on one specific aspect of the internal energy market. So in the following, I will be speaking about electricity, and I will be speaking about the electricity wholesale market. I've been asked to speak about an electricity market design at last, question mark, and I emphasize the question mark. And as you'll see from my presentation, this isn't the only question mark in my presentation. So if I think back maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been of the opinion that we were quickly converging on an integrated European electricity market. We'd been dealing with a lot of obstacles to cross-border trades, so interconnectors were being reinforced. Certainly in Central Western Europe, we were integrating the trading of energy and the use of interconnectors by creating what is known as a market coupling regime, where in an integrated manner we decide over the use of interconnectors and the use of power stations. So then about 2 years ago, a new development arose, and for various reasons, a number of governments and member states decided that the product that should be traded in the electricity market should no longer only be energy, megawatt hours, but that there should be separate and mandated remuneration of capacity. And from what seemed to converge on an integrated market, we actually moved into a very fragmented picture. And this picture indicates what different member states are doing in terms of remunerating and rewarding capacity. And by the differences in colors alone, you already realize that this doesn't look like a very integrated market. So we had some old school measures like capacity payments. Generators received a payment for capacity just for the fact that they were there. These were regimes used in the Iberian Peninsula and in Italy until recently, or in Ireland. Then we had other schemes which initially emerged in Scandinavia, which said that we'll put some capacity in reserve and we'll pay that capacity some extra money. But these units, which are under these contracts for some extra reward, they are no longer allowed to participate in the electricity wholesale market, in the megawatt hour market. And this is known. This is what became known as the strategic reserve. But then we also had other mechanisms where it was mandated that the whole market should be covered by capacity payments, but two alternative approaches to that. One is a central entity that tenders capacity contracts to the whole of the market, and beneficiaries have to bid to receive one of those contracts, or an alternative approach which was developed in France to say we impose an obligation on retailers to contract capacity and make capacity payments. We don't tell the retailers exactly how they do it. We only say you have to show us that you have these contracts, and we then leave it to the retailers to decide how they contract this capacity. And this has led to this fragmented picture which I am showing here. So the question that now arises is that leading us away from the integrated market? And indeed, the European Commission became quite nervous about these mechanisms. And so they decided to look at this from a state aid perspective. State aid is quite interesting because state aid legislation applies to any industry in Europe. Since a few years ago, we have specific guidelines for the application of state aid in the energy sector. And the logic and the link to our discussion here is that these capacity payments lead to either direct payments between governments or government entities to generators, or it leads to payments that wouldn't arise in a market and which only arise because a capacity market is being mandated by the authorities. So the Commission started looking at this based on the principles of state aid. And indeed, there are currently two processes ongoing in the EU. And luckily, we have a few stakeholders also in the audience who are involved in this process. So the first process is known as the sector inquiry. The second process is known as the blueprint process. And I'll just explain the distinctions between the two. So the sector inquiry is led by DG Comp, so the Competition Directorate, and it looks at whether regimes that exist should have been notified to the European Commission under state aid legislation, and it looks at whether those schemes which are being used, whether they're actually compliant with state aid legislation. And DG Comp will be looking at, well, is there actually a need for a capacity mechanism in the first instance? Is it proportional? So is the degree of intervention proportional to whatever the problem is that is trying to be addressed? And also, are these regimes non-discriminatory? And I'll come on to non-discrimination in a minute. The conclusion of this may be that the Commission decides that certain regimes should have been notified, and it may decide that certain regimes are not entirely compliant and therefore may need to be adapted. We've seen a draft consultation out this week. The process will obviously continue, but this is a process which is in full swing, and for those who are interested, they obviously have the opportunity to participate and to contribute in that process. The alternative process is known as the blueprint process, and this process is being led by DG Energy. And this has a slightly different focus. This is looking more at whether state aid legislation and the application of state aid legislation is enough to create an integrated and internal energy market, or whether further legislation may be required to ensure that we develop and we evolve into a harmonized and functional market. And things that DG Energy is looking at is, for example, a framework for establishing generation adequacy. So a way of identifying whether we have a capacity problem or not in the first instance. It's looking at the design of capacity remuneration mechanisms with a view to possibly coming up with a blueprint or several blueprints, hence the title of blueprints. And it's specifically also looking at ensuring international participation in national capacity remuneration mechanisms. The result from this process could be a new legal initiative. So this could evolve into a new network code, which may then be turned, for example, into a regulation which would then be directly applicable in all member states. The idea by DG Enne is to come up with a proposal at the end of this year. So let's just look at some of the emerging thinking which you may be able to read from the consultation document that I mentioned, but also from conversations and consultations that happen at the EU level, but also at national level. As I already hinted, there seems to be three areas of interest. So one area of interest is that of the adequacy assessment. So identifying approaches and means to establishing whether or not we in Europe or individual countries have a capacity issue. It is looking at national capacity remuneration mechanisms, and it's looking at how players from other countries can participate in these mechanisms. Now, how is this linked to state aid legislation? This is what I try to indicate through the light blue boxes at the top. So the principles of state aid legislation are quite clear. I've written them out at the top, and I think they immediately relate to the different areas of discussion that we see in this debate. So first of all, state aid can be granted, can be provided if it relates to an issue of common interest like security of supply, generation adequacy, and there is a need to be addressed. So whether or not there is a capacity issue or a security of supply issue is an important aspect of of that discussion and that investigation. Further principles are appropriateness, incentives, proportionality. Appropriateness means that whatever measure is taken actually addresses the issue that has been identified. Incentive means that whenever state aid is granted, it needs to trigger some reaction which wouldn't have arisen had the state aid not been there. So you cannot pay people money for things they would have been doing anyway under state aid legislation. And it needs to be proportional. So the amount of money paid needs to be the minimum required to achieve the response that you're looking at. And overall, all of this needs to make sure that we avoid distortions to competition. So just briefly skipping through these three areas, what is actually meant. So the emerging thinking here is that if you want to introduce a capacity mechanism, you need to show through an adequacy assessment that your country faces a problem. There is then a discussion around whether there should be a common European approach to this. So maybe an approach which is managed, operated, or designed by NSOE. So here we're already moving into the governance discussion. Possibly there should even be a common modeling. So maybe there should only be one model on one computer or one server that does the calculations for all regions in Europe to establish whether there is an adequacy issue or not. So then you may ask, well, what about subsidiarity? Well, there can still be aspects of subsidiarity in this. So, for example, each member state may then be able to decide how much security of supply, what level of adequacy it likes, but it may need to decide so within a given framework and possibly even a given modeling framework. Then moving on to the next pillar, the national capacity remuneration mechanism. Here the emerging principle is that whatever measure is taken needs to focus and address the cause of the issue. Further thinking is that before any significant measures are taken and to remain proportional, you should try and exploit all reform possibilities that exist within what's known as the energy-only market. So specifically balancing arrangements may need to be sharpened and tightened. There needs to be a competitive design. So when capacity payments are granted, this may need to come, for example, through an auction mechanism. And these mechanisms need to be non-discriminatory. So you can't say, I'll only make this payment to gas stations, but not to coal stations, or only to coal stations, but not to renewables or some other technology. And lastly, and the further complication is then the cross-border participation, on which I think there's now a good framework for discussion, but it's obviously quite complex to integrate this with the already complex discussion around national mechanisms. So questions here are, who participates in these mechanisms? Is it interconnectors, or is it generators, or is it both? Can it be only one or the other? Does there need to be proof that interconnectors are available and that you as a participant actually have a right to use that interconnector on which you're claiming you're supplying your capacity to the other country? For this assessment, do interconnectors need to be derated? So can you only claim to be able to use part of an interconnector that exists? And for practical purposes, should there maybe be some transitional exemptions so that those countries who like to use capacity mechanisms get those up and running fairly early on, while they're still working on arrangements for cross-border participation? So this is just some of the emerging thinking. So as I emphasized, an important starting point is to identify a need, so an adequacy issue, and also to identify and to clarify that this issue cannot be addressed by existing market forces alone. So important aspect is to identify a cause. And in the political debate, we see a number of causes or reasons or justifications for capacity mechanisms, But not all of them really serve to justify capacity mechanisms under state aid legislation. So some say, well, because the market is evolving and certain things have happened that people didn't anticipate, this creates issues for generators. Well, that may be the case, but that is just what you expect in any competitive market, that the market doesn't always develop in the way that you hope and you predict. And this alone is no justification for capacity mechanisms. There may be a further issue of political intervention in the market. For example, some argue that they've been taken by surprise by the level and degree of renewable promotion. Again, you can question whether that's a justification for capacity mechanism. You might be arguing for some stranded cost recovery mechanism if truly the national government had in some way misled national players about what it was doing on the renewables front. But again, no immediate justification for a capacity mechanism. And then we move into the area where there may be justifications for capacity mechanisms. These justifications, they've actually emerged and have been developed in international debate and international literature, not just in Europe, but also in the US, and therefore the link to the FERC that was mentioned by Director Ristori here is quite interesting. So broadly speaking, 4 arguments which can be used. One argument is that security of supply is a public good. So no individual consumer or no individual generator may be prepared to care for the security of supply, because everyone may think, well, there's someone in the background who will take care in the end, and I don't need to take care. This is a highly disputed argument, highly controversial argument. And we would actually say that there are certain reforms that you can undertake, for example, tightening, sharpening the balancing mechanism, which actually puts responsibility on generators and on users to keep in balance, and this is supportive of maintaining capacity. So this indicates that not all of these justifications may be used to justify a capacity mechanism. There may be other simpler mechanisms to achieve something. Further arguments have been a prohibitive price risk, a missing money problem due to regulation or the threat of regulation or intervention of governments, in the case of peaking electricity prices, which might be a justifiable argument, and also possible inconsistencies between national capacity mechanisms, which may lead to implications for other countries. So, for example, France introducing a capacity mechanism may have implications for Belgium or the Netherlands or Germany or other countries. And it may create a domino effect that because a capacity mechanism in one country distorts the playing field, other countries may be tempted to introduce capacity mechanisms as well. It is the precise reason of this threat of losing the level playing field that the Commission is actually intervening with its sector inquiry into capacity mechanisms. So important then is that if you adopt a capacity mechanism, that the capacity mechanism addresses the issue that you have identified. And this chart is just indicating that there are a number of tools if you want to pursue with capacity mechanisms. They have different features and they serve different objectives. So what we've drawn in this map here is on the one axis the question of whether the mechanism is decided centrally or decentrally. So centrally is on the right. There's a central agent deciding on how much capacity is contracted. Or towards the left, decentral players like retailers decide on how much capacity they contract. And then from top to bottom, whether the scope of this capacity mechanism is all-encompassing towards the bottom, or whether it only relates to a fraction of capacity, like in the strategic reserve used in some of the Scandinavian countries. And if you look at it from this perspective, you can already realize that different tools, different mechanisms can serve different objectives. So, for example, the strategic reserve clearly has a transitional function. So it's something that happens well outside the normal energy market. It only covers some of the capacity. It's a mechanism which is temporary and which can easily be removed. So this a mechanism used by countries who principally have trust in the energy-only markets, but they have a slight degree of uncertainty, and they want to keep some reserve in the background. Whereas the more far-reaching mechanisms, they serve more to address fundamentally perceived issues in the market. So then a remaining question in this is, so assume each individual country adopts a capacity mechanism which addresses its national issue, and let's assume that mechanism was also compliant with the broad principles of state aid legislation. We may still arrive at the very patchy map that I showed at the start of my presentation, which raises the question, which DG ENER is currently looking at, whether that is sensible. So there could actually be a common interest which goes beyond the existing state aid legislation to say, well, come on, let's try and harmonize our mechanisms, and let's try and work in a common direction. And this is what's trying to be addressed by the blueprint process. So finally, leading on to governance, and what does this imply for governance? Here's a quick attempt, and we call it a straw man, of how this debate may evolve into a governance arrangement for the electricity market. And this is by no means the final word. We call it the straw man because we want to emphasize that this should just be a focal point for discussion. So we have these three pillars which I showed earlier. We have the adequacy assessment, we have the capacity remuneration mechanism, and we have the issue of cross-border participation. And we have various of the known stakeholders. So we have the European Commission in the guise or in the shape of DG ENER. We have it in the shape of DG Comp, that's the second line. We have ACER, we have national member states, and for example, we have NSOE, and we could continue with a long list of other stakeholders. And let's just look at what the roles of these different players might be in this future world. So, for example, what may emerge out of the blueprint process is that DG ENER or a regulation requires that there's a common criteria and a common framework for assessing generation adequacy, whether it's achieved, whether it's under threat. The implementation and the detailed development of that approach could rest, for example, with NSOE. So that would be an approach which would be quite similar and consistent with an approach which has been adopted for other network codes. ACER may have a word in approving whatever NSOE comes up with as a suggestion, and individual member states may have the option to set their national adequacy targets, but taking account of the generally agreed principles, generally agreed framework. So that's for the adequacy assessment. Then looking at national mechanisms and also cross-border participation. And here you see already that the boxes go across. So in the final stage, we really see the introduction of national mechanisms and cross-border participation part of an integral model. So, for example, DG ENER may define one or several blueprint models to address distinct issues. It may then happen that these get converted into network codes, regulations, and so on. A question that may then arise is that if we have this tighter framework of state aid legislation, what role remains for DG Comp? So should DG Comp still need to authorize any individual capacity remuneration mechanisms? Or would there be some sort of what's known as a block exemption, that once you're compliant with the model and the network code, you may no longer need specific approval? The role of member states would obviously be to develop their mechanisms and to notify them to the Commission. and to demonstrate that in the first instance there is an adequacy concern. I think the roles both of ACER and ENTSO-E would be less clear in this world. I think there's a wider discussion around the role of ENTSO-E at any rate, because the role is slightly odd as a trade body for TSOs on the one hand, but on the other hand a sort of technical regulator, and so there may be certain changes there anyway. So I think the role of ENTSO-E would need to be thought through quite carefully. And equally, it's not immediately clear what exactly the role of ACER in this would be, because I suppose the issues to deal with here are less issues between countries. The issues are more between the Commission and individual member states. And again, it's a question of the wider governance arrangements, what exactly the role of ACER would be in this. So this brings me to the conclusion, and I hope it also leads into the following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. With this, we can move to the second, let's say, topic. We will try to shed light on what has already been mentioned. So the new role of ACER. We will have 2 points of view here, 2 perspectives. The first one by Mr. Dietmar Prienstorfer, the head of international relations in the Austrian regulator e-control. Mr. Prienstorfer was also a national expert in CER, and he is the Austria's alternate member in the ACER Board of Regulators. So please go ahead with your presentation, and then we will continue with Mr. Hesseling's views.
It's okay. So thank you. Thank you first for the invitation to this very interesting event here today. Thank you for the introduction, Chairman. I'm today here to talk about the role of the agency. Has to fulfill, has a certain task in as regards the internal energy market, and we always need to think. I'm trying now to set the scene. We're working towards the establishment of the internal energy market, or the creation. So whatever that at the end really might be. We have heard from the Commission that it should have been completed by the end of 2014. We heard the Commission announcing that, and it was completed by definition that the CACM network code has been put in place and into force. So capacity allocation and congestion management in electricity. So this is already, of course, the right way down, because we see with that all these new mechanisms have been established, market coupling at the EU borders. We see a price convergence across Europe and lowering prices. So this is, of course, the right direction. What we have heard by Mr. Ristori today is that these benefits haven't arrived yet for the consumers. So there still has to be a lot of things to done. So maybe then the next challenges, in addition to that, what Christoph Riechmann mentioned right now, so we're facing now new problems. Now we're using efficiently the existing infrastructure, and now we have problems with the generation. So we have to fix another problem. So it will be an ongoing process, the integration of the internal energy market, and maybe one of the last summits will be the retail market integration, that also then the final consumers have benefits and may harvest really the benefits directly from the creation of the internal energy market. So for doing that, you need institutions, because without institutions this will not work, and you need experts. So and therefore in the last third package, these new bodies were established, in particular ACER, the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, with the view to bring the knowledge of the EU energy regulatory authorities together into one agency, and to develop a new framework to manage that process, and to make proposals together with the ANSWERs for the European Commission to develop a EU-wide grid code for harmonizing the market rules. Yeah? So ACER was established in 2010, started work in 2011 and achieved a lot. But of course, after a reflection of 5 years what has been done, I want to be a little bit critical today. So this is my role to be a little bit the advocatus diaboli in this role. And maybe later on, Dennis may defend then and say, but I will also say that ACER did a lot of good and performed well. But I will say, try to point out where ACER could have done to be better. So first here, ACER's tasks according to the third package, maybe not complete task, yeah? And I will go then into more detail in the two topics in red color. So first of all, one is that ACER exists and develop good results in an effective and efficient way. So ACER in general had performed quite well since 2011, but there are still some uncertainties as regards the roles and responsibilities between the different ACER bodies. Second thing, the rule making, so the process of developing framework guidelines and network cost in general, one could say it worked quite well. Basically also this process is being completed. I need to say that to our impression, please, all what I say here, this is the position, the viewpoint of e-control and my personal view. So these are not ACERs or the Board of Regulators, so this is an e-control view. So the rule making was quite okay, maybe a little bit better in gas than in electricity. In gas we are better advanced, we have nearly all network code completed. In electricity we're a little bit lacking behind. And still the network codes we should have prepared then in the middle of the process have been transferred to normal Commission guidelines with a lot of still open questions and gaps, and now we are about to implement all the open questions that have been left open by the answers. So of course electricity, you could say it's more complex, the whole electricity system, than the gas. But anyway, at the end it counts. We are a little bit better, to my understanding, in the gas sector than in the electricity sector. But in general, the rule making went quite well. I think we need a better process for amendment of rules. Here we need a clear, light and transparent process. Another task of ACER is the monitoring part. I think here this works quite well, and this can be maintained. Enforcement, yeah? When you want to establish a body in Europe that should play a certain role, then this body needs to have powers, yeah? And if ACER makes rules or proposes rules or is responsible in implementing rules and cannot enforce it, then ACER might be, I use it here, the term, like a lame duck, yeah? So I leave this to the lawyers to answer that, how to give ACER the right powers to address these issues. But as usually a normal authority on a national level has those powers also for enforcement. So need to find something that also on a European level we have that powers. Another thing is arbitration between NRAs. And here say we need a clear and transparent process and procedural rules. There was one key case. There's the peer review process asked by the Polish regulator where with the loop flow thing and whether this, if there is a congestion on between the Austrian and German border. There was a result, and the result was in a way that ACER came up with a recommendation. But this recommendation was a non-binding recommendation, but this has, of course, huge effects. Now on the Austrian-German border, when we're working towards the integration of the energy market, we have an existing capacity of more than 10,000 megawatt, which is huge, one of the biggest borders in the EU. 10,000 megawatts between two countries. Now we have to reduce it, to limit it, to artificially congest it and introduce congestion management here. And my question again to the lawyers is, at the end it turns out that after we have introduced congestion management at our borders and nothing changed with the loop flow or the situation on the German-Polish border, who at the end will be responsible? Who takes the responsibility for that? Currently, this is based on a recommendation by ACER, which cannot be appealed by a body. And we tried to appeal it, but the ACER Board of Appeal answered that, look, it's just a recommendation, it's not legal binding, but at the end it has effects. So whenever ACER is coming up with, and is going to decide, where I think ACER should decide, I will come to that, yeah? Then ACER needs also clear structure and also responsibilities. And we need the procedural rules, and we need the possibility that all those decisions can be appealed, as it's quite normal in our national jurisdictions. The second point is then oversight of answers. I'll try to stick to the time that I will not exceed more than 15 to 17 minutes. That also then we have enough possibilities for discussion and also for Dennis for his presentation. Oversight of answers. So we have heard it in Christoph Riechmann's presentation that, and I also said it already a little bit, one is not really so happy with the answers. ANSOs are an organization which have the members, the national TSOs, and they should fulfill a European function. They should be a market facilitator. So, and I say it now, it's my view and my impression that they act more and more in their own interest as maybe a lobbyist for their interest, and rather as performing their foreseen function as a market facilitator in the European interest. So, and here we have to find solutions. Remember when we introduced unbundling, yeah? And we had that conflict if we maintain the ownership, but it has to perform the functions. We had the ITO model, yeah? We have the ITO model, which is very, very strictly regulated. Maybe some of these concepts of the ITO model could be also used then here later on for the ENSO-E and ENSO-G. So let's come to the ACER internal procedures. So we have at ACER the different bodies. It's the administrative board, we have a board of appeal, and then a board of regulators and the director. And I want to talk about the board of regulators and the director, because those ones who come up and prepare and do the regulatory thing and do the regulatory decisions. And here we see a picture that and this chart quite nicely displays what are the overall resources of that agency. Consists of the director as the body at the one side and the board of regulators with 28 representatives of the EU 28 NRAs. And then we have the ACER staff, Dennis belongs to it, and then we have the ACER working groups and assistants where I belong to as well. So, and in total this is quite a lot of people. The BOR and the ACER working groups with the experts in the member states countries clearly outnumber the ACER staff, and only together we can really prepare the results, where I see that the national experience is brought in by the NRA. Nobody expects from ACER that they know the very last detail of the problems in the Baltic countries, in Lithuania, as well as in Austria or in Croatia. So this can only be done by the national experts, and maybe ACER and the staff bring it together, in particular when it comes to monitoring and other things. So this is very important. Only by coexistence it can work quite well. So this is now a complicated slide. So again, so the tasks of ACER may be displayed in another format. We have here the regulatory design. I mentioned previously policy making, but I was reminded that only policy can be made by the European Commission, so with the regulatory design. So this is the framework guide and network code process, where we think it should be done, and the proposal should be a bottom-up from the NRAs, from the national regulatory authorities, because what we want to achieve, we want to harmonize our rules. And harmonization of rules is a slowly process, and only if you do it in the right way, then you move forward in the right direction. And what here in this process the European Commission wanted is a proposal which is backed by the 28 NRAs, that then at the discussion at the Council, when it comes to the real decision and when European law is made out of that, then there is not that much more technical discussion, because we are talking really about very, very technical stuff here. So our proposal would be that in future the regulatory design is done just by the NRAs or the Board of Regulators, leaving the director out of that. Because why I say that? Because the current process is done in a way that the director prepares all the documents and his views with the input of the staff and the working groups, his proposals, and brings into his views maybe a European perspective. And then the Board of Regulators only say yes or no to this proposal. So, and this has some effects that maybe, how to say it, in not the right messages at the end brought through the recipients or of that work to the European Commission and the Council. It's a little bit shaded, yeah? Maybe a little bit Pharisäische approach, or in German one would say a bisschen scheinheilig. Yeah? So I think there is room for improvement. Then on the other side, individual implementation and enforcement should be done, we say, by the director. We've seen it also in our peer review case that we were in that decision not independent. Of course, our Polish colleagues were not independent, as well as the Czech, the Slovaks, and the Hungarians. They were not independent in that decision. So maybe it's better to have that director deciding on those topics when it comes to real binding decisions, and also taking over the responsibility, using right internal procedures, and also the possibility to appeal those things. So this would be our proposal. The other task, like monitoring, data collection, and also oversight of specific bodies about answers, we think this can be continued in the same way as right now, as does the director. The team makes a proposal, the director reviews, brings his viewpoint in, and then the BOR decides it, and then the end director adopts it. I'm thinking I'm running out of time, so I will be brief now with the oversight and enforcement of ANSOS. I also think that Dennis will have some proposal, and there we will not differ too much. I think there has to be done something. ACER should also have the power to make binding decisions on the ANSOS. I just give an example. When there's an obligation that the NSOE makes a report on research and development outlook, yeah, and then ACER makes a recommendation, and usually with the recommendation you can throw it away and do nothing. But if there is really the issue that you say, okay, we find it useful and important that this really is going to be developed and implemented, then it should also be binding. Of course, again, with the right from the NSOS to challenge it and to appeal it in the Board of Appeal and in the other bodies. So, as regards keeping to the time, I would stop here now. And I'm happy for the discussion and answering questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dietmar. Now I will invite Mr. Dennis Hesseling from ACER, the head of gas department, but also having experience in competition law from his previous work in the National Competition Authority in the Netherlands. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lucas, for the introduction. I think it's good indeed to compare the views. I mean, you've heard a number of issues already about, let's say, regulatory oversight and how it should be, how it works now and how it could be improved. I was very curious to hear what Dietmar was going to say about the role of the NRA and the agency. I'm happy to say that for most things, actually, we agree. For many things, in particular of the analysis on where the issues are and what needs to be addressed, I think we're very close. There are some internal views on who should do what between, let's say, the agency and the NRAs, where we may have a bit of a different view, but I'll come to that a bit later. Given that we have quite a large audience here and a diverse audience as well, I think maybe it's good to say a few things about the current role of the agency before going into what the changes might be and why they might be necessary. So I'll very briefly take you through, let's say, the main legal basis that we work on and how we do it, give you a few examples to get a feeling of what we're doing. And then I'll speak about what we see coming our way and where we think there may be, let's say, room for improvement to strengthen the regulatory oversight. If you look at the history, the short history of the agency and what the legal basis is, there's basically three packages which we work on. The third energy package, the REMIT regulation on wholesale market integrity, and the 10E regulation for infrastructure. If you compare those three in terms of the role that is given to the agency, it's quite different. In the first one, in the third energy package, it's all, let's say, advisory, preparatory, reporting, and there's very little, probably no, let's say, power in there included whatsoever. It's really based on the cooperation model. It's together with the NRAs, which is very good, and I support that. But it gives a very, let's say, weak or soft role to the agency. Then comes REMIT, and REMIT says all data collection shall happen centrally through the agency. So we have now a huge database of all electricity and gas trading data as of October last year at the agency, which we then make available to the NRAs because they do the, let's say, the enforcement. They look if there's some breaches of the REMIT regulation, and they do the enforcement and we coordinate. So again, there's no hard power at the agency, but there is a lot of data coming our way, and so a lot of information is available to us. And then for the third one, the 10E regulation, again, based largely on the same model, but with a few interesting changes. So a lot of it is indeed reporting, is monitoring, but in a few cases where NRAs cannot agree, and I'll give you an example later on, there is actually the hard power for the agency to intervene, to step in, and to say, well, in this case, we now take over, we have the power for this case, and we will take a binding decision. And that was not possible under the first or the second, let's say, legal package that gave us a role to play. So if you look at this, apparently the legislator over time has come to the view that it's actually possible to give a bit more powers in certain cases to the agency. And we'll have to see how this trend continues in the future. I'll give you examples from the three areas that we work on: the framework guidelines, network codes, the market monitoring, and the infrastructure, as an example of how this is done at the moment. And then we can talk about, okay, what does it mean? Let's say, what does it mean for the government? How hard or how soft are these powers, and what may need to be changed in the future? So the first area, maybe the most well-known one, the development of the network codes, which in the end become binding rules for the EU energy market, both for gas and electricity. Basically, we have a preparatory role here, and the Commission holds all the lines. The Commission picks a topic from the list and say, well, now let's do a scoping exercise to see if something needs to be developed in terms of binding legislation, network code in the end, for this particular topic. We do the scoping, we check with all the stakeholders if there's a need for a rule on this one, yes or no. We report back to the Commission says, okay, please start developing a framework guideline. We get half a year to do so, which should set out the main principles which should be covered by this framework guideline. Goes back to the Commission checks, if they're fine with it, goes to ENSO E, ENSO G, and they then have 1 year with, again, lots of stakeholder consultations to develop a more technical version of the framework guideline. So they should not change anything of substance, but they should detail it in such a way that it works for all the TSOs across the EU, which is a lot of work, and it's very important that it's done properly. Comes back to us, we check with the framework guidelines, does it comply, let's say, yes or no? We give an opinion, it's not binding, and in the end we recommend to the Commission and we say, we recommend you to move forward with the network code, maybe with a few changes, if we are not convinced that the network code is fully in line with the framework guideline. Commission takes over, can change anything they want. If they're not satisfied, they can still redraft the whole network code. Normally they don't do it. Normally they take at least the vast majority of what the ENSOs and we have delivered. They put it forward to comitology, it goes to the member states, and in the end we will have a new network code in place, which will become legally binding as the date of application. So the role that we have, it's an important technical role, but it's a very preparatory role, and we don't have any, let's say, hard powers in this one. It was mentioned already, where do we stand now with the network codes? I think in gas we're hope to be almost done. We have 4 network codes in place, Commission guidelines, congestion management, capacity allocation, balancing, interoperability will be applicable as of this year. And then tariffs is in the final phase, we hope. It's going to the member state meetings, comitology process, and we hope to have a vote somewhere later this year, and we don't see an immediate need for a new network code, at least on the gas side. So I think then we should have, let's say, the European rules pretty much ready for the time being. I'm sure there'll be rounds of amendments, but the overall framework should be pretty much set. That's the first part. Third energy package, role of the agency, preparatory work codes, which in the end become binding. Second aspect, market monitoring. Here we do things like looking at price levels and price convergence. Of course, we work towards, these rules should work towards integrating and harmonizing the European energy market. As an example, in gas, we look at the price differences between the different gas hubs. And if you then look at the differences between what we see as the benchmark price, this is 2014 data in yellow TTF, and those hubs where the price is within €1 per megawatt hour from the benchmark, this is what you see. It's, let's say, the core part, which is really well integrated and where there's almost no price differences in 2014. There's a part surrounding that, which includes France, Italy, Spain, Poland, where the price difference is a bit bigger, €1 to €3 per megawatt hour, compared to the TTF average price in 2014. And there's a price which is a bit more peripheral and where people really pay a much higher price for the same gas, basically. Lack of infrastructure, lack of competition, and that's why people, consumers in those markets, pay much, much more for the same gas. And it shows that we're still not there when it comes to integrating the market. We're now redoing the exercise based on 2015 data. This is 2014. You see the yellow area spreading. So you see that now also, and the first results that we have, Austria, Slovakia are also yellow, France is yellow, Slovenia is light blue, Greece is light blue. So the colors are changing, and we can track in this way over time to what extent the market is being integrated and harmonized, and we see the prices coming down to what we think the competitive, well, the market thinks the competitive level is. So our role here is just we monitor, we see to what extent we are overall making progress with the internal energy market. We don't stop at the European borders because we also look at, for instance, Ukraine to see what is happening there. And this chart shows you in a very interesting way the developments in 2014, 2015, when the Russian gas exports to Ukraine were cut in the summer. And it shows you two things. One is on the bars that you have here, the blue and yellow ones, they're the volumes. They show you how much was exported from the blue ones, Russia into Ukraine, or the yellow ones, EU into Ukraine. On the top you see the price levels. Again, blue is Russian price, Russian gas priced into Ukraine. Yellow one is gas coming from EU into Ukraine. This shows you what the integration of the internal EU market in gas enabled, not only inside the EU, but also for a neighboring market as Ukraine. The fact that we had Slovak interconnection point in reverse flow in the summer of 2014, that was really the key enabling factor to make sure that the gas could start flowing in reverse from the west towards Ukraine. And you see that it doesn't fully compensate for the Russian volumes, but it covers quite a bit and much more than in the past. And so there are now, let's say, two main sources of gas from which Ukraine can source. One is, of course, the obvious one from Russia, but they also have quite some volumes they can cover from the west, from the EU hubs. And pricing was quite competitive. The pricing you see for the gas coming from the EU was for quite some time in 2014 until beginning of 2015 cheaper than what they would have paid for Russian gas at that time. Only when oil came down, Russian gas price followed, and then it became competitive again. What we do, we monitor. We look at the data, we analyze, we make it publicly available, and we see to what extent the integration of the internal, in this case gas market, is advancing, yes or no. Third example, infrastructure. This is the 10E package, the third one that I mentioned in the beginning. Again, we do lots of monitoring on the PCIs, projects of common interest. On the 10-way NDP, we give an opinion towards the ENSOs, whether we think they've done their job properly for the 10-year network development plan. We give a very interesting report on unit investment cost to, let's say, give insight to investors and also to NRAs and TSOs what, let's say, average or ranges of cost would be for certain investments, electricity and gas. Very first one, as far as I know, in Europe to do this work. And we have, as an exception, in some cases, the possibility to take binding decisions. This is for the cross-border cost allocation cases where normally the NRAs who are concerned with such an investment request manage to agree amongst themselves how the costs should be split. Because in some cases, one country will face more cost than benefits, the neighboring countries will benefit, and they have to agree on an allocation of the cost to make the whole thing work out. In some cases, it doesn't work. The NRAs have half a year to do it, to take a decision on a CBCA, an investment request. If they cannot manage, after half a year, the case automatically comes to ACER, and we will take over the case. And we have 3 months to take a binding decision. That happened twice so far, once in gas, once in electricity, and I'm showing you now the gas example, which was the gas interconnector Poland-Lithuania. Significant pipeline to make sure that the Baltic states' gas market isolation would be ended, investment of about 550 million euros, and an unequal distribution of cost and benefits. This was 2014, so we took over the case and we looked at what the case looked like. And if you see then the cost and benefits, which is in the top right of this chart, benefits are in blue, costs are in red. Those are the 4 member states concerned: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. For Poland, it's quite clear. Overall, the project is beneficial for, let's say, the 4 countries combined. But why would a Polish TSO invest in something where the cost for them is higher than the benefits for their country? They shouldn't do it. So they need a proportion of the cost to be carried by their neighbors. That was the main question, and in the end we went through all the calculations. We checked what we thought, let's say, a reasonable allocation of the cost would be for the part that needs to be allocated cross-border, and we came up with a formula which basically said that the Lithuanian TSO should carry 2/3 of the cost part that needs to be transferred, the Latvian 1/3, and a very small part for the Estonian one. And it's a binding decision which can be appealed, wasn't appealed in this case, and then in the end it leads to obligations for the NRAs to include those, let's say, those amounts which the TSOs have to pay into the national tariff systems, and then it should enable this investment to go through. So what you've seen so far, network codes, preparatory work for the agency, market monitoring, reporting, infrastructure, mostly reporting and opinions, and in some very specific cases, taking decisions. That's what we have at the moment. That's our current package. For the future role, we're looking at what the Commission is saying, and Vice President Šefčovič is a very outspoken person on the Energy Union, of course, and he speaks about this at the infrastructure forum in Copenhagen last year, a significant strengthening of the powers and independence of the agency. And we're always wondering what it would mean. So we're reading Commission documents to see what kind of thinking is emerging from their publications. First of all, in the Energy Union communication, they describe what the problem is at the moment, as they see it, and they say ACER currently has very limited decision-making rights, which is true. I think that's the current situation. And then they say, we, the Commission, think that there should be a strengthening of the regulation of the single market by giving significant reinforcement of the powers and independence of ACER to carry out regulatory functions at EU level. At the moment, we don't really act as a regulator. We act together with all the regulators. We don't regulate anybody. We don't regulate the ENSOs. We don't regulate any TSO. We have functions which are very close to regulatory work, but we don't act as a proper regulator. And the Commission may want to foresee in some cases that we get more of these powers. What could be done? Again, different Commission communication. The powers independence may need to be reinforced to enable us to carry out regulatory functions at EU level where needed, and to arbitrate in regional and EU level disputes. Now, arbitration could be a very useful thing because we have no intention to take over all the things which are happening now at NRA level. But in some cases, we do see NRAs getting stuck at regional level. They try to cooperate with 2, 3, 4, 5 NRAs, and they disagree. And then what happens then? They have a next meeting because they don't have a governance structure to allow them to take a binding decision. And they cannot force any of the disagreeing, let's say, minority, with however good or bad reasoning, to say, listen, now we have to move ahead. In such cases, it would actually be useful to ensure the process continues and comes to an end, to say, you have a certain amount of time. If you NRAs in the region cannot agree, then let's give the case to the agency, like in CBCA. We will take over if needed, and we will take a binding decision, and then the whole process moves on. And it avoids that you end up in endless, let's say, discussions and new meetings without reaching a final conclusion. We did some thinking as well by, let's say, ourselves with the agency and the NRAs in a paper called The Bridge to 2025, where we say we think that what we see coming our way, the policy signals we get from the Commission and from Parliament, tend to say that we should have a bigger role, and what should it look like? What kind of things could we foresee in a useful, in a meaningful way? And some things have been mentioned already. The oversight of the ENSOs. I think we agree with what Christoph and what Dietmar already said. The ENSOs are, let's say, a strange combination of, on the one hand, being really representing their memberships, and the memberships can be private companies with private interests, and at the other hand, having very clear European functions. And those two do not always go very well together. We think the ENSOs have very good and competent people in their offices. At the same time, in their internal governance, they are driven very strongly by their membership. And if one member disagrees, the whole thing may stop. So the governance of the ANSERs, we cannot say, and we can of course issue opinions about the ANSERs and say, well, we think you should do this or that. But as Dietmar said, if they don't like it, they can just ignore it. They don't have to follow anything we say about their internal governance. If you want to change this, you need some regulatory oversight at EU level of the ANSERs, both ANSER-E and ANSER-G. And we think it may probably make sense to give such a role to the agency. For NRA coordination, the peer review case was already mentioned. We have a mechanism whereby an NRA can bring forward a case for the agency for a peer review. At the moment, we have to wait for cases to come our way. We think it might make sense to also allow us to initiate a case ourselves and say, well, actually, we think in this particular case, we would need to start a peer review process because we think we need a wider, let's say, agreement or view on a particular topic. And then for monitoring, we depend, I showed you the monitoring results, well, 2 examples out of many that we have on how we view the market. We depend on publicly available data. We have no, and the NRAs who cooperate with us, but we have no powers by ourselves to request data that we think we need for market monitoring purposes. And we think it weakens our position if you really want to have proper market monitoring and make it available publicly to all market participants. We think we need the power to request the data that we need to do the market monitoring in a proper way. On the regulatory oversight of the ANSERs, we think for the ANSERs themselves, it is relatively clear that they are European bodies, they have a European function. It's relatively obvious that the oversight should probably come to the agency in some way. And it would be very helpful if we could indeed in some way force them to do certain things. The enforcement, I think, is lacking at the moment. If you have to go to the Commission every time you think something needs to be done, it weakens your position, and it would be helpful to have more enforcement powers there. For regional bodies, however, it is not so obvious, because we have quite a number of regional institutions as well. Think about the booking platforms in gas. They're not clearly European, but they're clearly larger than national. Who should do the oversight there? And there's a bit more of a question who would take this role on himself or herself. In electricity, we have the NEMOs who have to actually cooperate to have to run the single algorithm. So at least you have, let's say, a push from the CSM network code to say this has to be done in a unified and harmonized way. In gas, we have booking platforms who have to, let's say, per IP you need a booking platform, but the booking platforms themselves don't have a mechanism in which they can cooperate. Now here the question is the oversight by the NRAs at, let's say, regional level, is that sufficient? And does it work for 2 NRAs, 3 NRAs? What about 5? What about 10 or 15? Or do you say now this becomes too complicated, there's no real mechanism, and we need to move this to the European level? I think that's for us one of the questions we are thinking about to see how we can provide input into the whole debate to ensure a proper oversight. I think I'll leave it at this, and then I'll leave it for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dennis. And now we'll move to the questions from the floor. I'm willing to take a few, which will still save us the coffee break. Please go ahead. When you ask the question, please introduce yourself and indicate the speaker to whom the question is directed. Yes, gentleman next to the monitor, please.
So thank you very much for the presentation. I so Christophe Poilian from GRT Gaz, also member of ENSOG and of GIE. So I definitely think it's important to improve role of ENSOG, ACER. It's also important to develop strong coordination and cooperation between the agencies. So you said, both of you, that perhaps the lobbying part of ENSOs in general was a bit confusing with the role at EU level. I think with regard to gas, we try to separate the ENSOG part, which is the European part, from the lobbying part, which is now done by GTE, so Gas Transmission Europe, as you may know. And it's more or less the same between ACER and CER, so there is also a lobbying arm of regulators, which often are promoted by CER, while ACER is much more neutral, I would say. So I think at least for gas, we are, as transmission system operators, really trying to do our best not to mix lobbying activities and the role of NSOG, which has to be as neutral as possible. So we definitely hope that we were successful in doing so when elaborating network codes, for instance. But at the same time, I also recognize the fact that we probably need more cooperation between NSOG and ACER with improved governance in that area.
Thank you. Any other questions at this stage? Yes, at the end, please.
Good day. My name is Denis Nazarenko. I represent civil society from Ukraine. And I have a question. First of all, I would like to say thank you for the great topics delivered. And I have a question for Mr. Prienstorfer. I noticed you mentioned that ACER is not very frequently takes particular decisions. And in this regard, I would like to ask, I'm not sure if you know, lately on the 41st PHLG here in Energy Community Secretariat made a proposition for the change of the treaty establishing the energy community. And one of the points was specifically referred to ACER, and it goes more or less like whenever ACER is competent on taking decisions on the situations on the borders of the member states and in situations when there's such well, I'm not I can't recall correctly word by word, but the main idea is that ACER would be empowered to take decisions on the situations on the border between member states and the contracting parties. I would like to ask, what do you think about that? And as long as I understood, there was not many cases when specific decisions was made. What kind of consequences such change in the treaty may entail? Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead.
I take the answer to this question first and maybe ask if somebody else, maybe you, Dennis, because Dennis is the recently newly appointed ACER ECRB, no? Okay. So then I try to answer. You know, there's a regulatory gap in the Energy Community Treaty that in particular the borders between the contracting parties and the EU member state jurisdiction is it's not clear how to treat that. So this was raised as concern last year in the 1.5 years ago in the high-level reflection group, where this was pointed out that this is a regulatory gap and this should be solved. This is still there, and of course it's important to have, if problems arise at these borders, who is the responsible, who is going to take the decision? Yeah, it could be either the European Commission or ACER. It could be the Energy Community Secretariat. It could be another body, but it has to be decided who is going to be responsible. It's possible that two bodies together decide, try to come up with a joint decision, and then find a solution. So there is still a regulatory gap. The Energy Community Secretariat and the Commission are aware of that. And it has to be addressed, and they have to come up with a solution how to solve that. I think if ACER is going to decide, then ACER would need to give some room within its structures also to the parties of the energy community, yeah? Because it would be somehow strange, yeah, if ACER is to decide on something which also affects, let's say, Ukraine, but for Ukraine representatives, this would be a closed border. Yeah? So there has to be something done. There's no clear answer yet, but this would be my answer. If ACER, yes, but then ACER should be somehow open or give room also to the bodies that are also affected by such a potential decision. Does this answer your question?
Maybe to add to what Dietmar has said already, I think the fact that there's a proposal now to give ACER this role is really a vote of confidence in how we can handle these kind of cases. And what Dietmar said about involving parties in the process, that's of course what we would do. We would not feel comfortable to hear only one side of the story and not the other. So we can only take on such a role if all parties from EU and energy community would be equally involved in the process. And then we would kind of take the technical role saying we looked at all the evidence, this is our final view on what should be done here. And maybe it applies not only to decisions, because it's only a very small part, but also to the more informal measures like opinions or recommendations. We have had, let's say, informal cases in the past where an energy community NRA was complaining about the tariffs at the border with the EU, but we couldn't do anything because we don't have this rule at this moment. And that could be opened up if this rule was foreseen in a treaty change in the energy community. On the first question by Christophe Payon about the way in which NSRG is dealing with, let's say, the two different roles it has, I'm sure you're making an effort to make it work, but for the moment it depends on the goodwill of the members of NSRG. And we cannot check internally, we don't know what's happening internally and what arguments carry the day. We know that quite often there are some TSOs who are resistant to some kind of proposal, and we can only guess why they're doing it, whether it's for private reasons or for good, let's say, technical reasons, we don't really know. So it depends on your goodwill. It may work, but it's not very transparent and not very robust.
Would like to add here something. ANSWERs have a function on the European level to prepare something what for the European interest. Yeah? The TSO, so it's not the similar bottom-up process like it's with ACER and the regulators, yeah, because ACER consists of national authorities, yeah, and also E-control not necessarily represent the Austrian national interests. Yeah, this is done by the ministry, but we are not representing others' interests. Yeah, but the real Austrian interest, this is up to the governance and to the politicians. So, but anyway, having said that, I quote here a colleague and a member of the board of regulators in the same discussion said one time that his TSO, electricity TSO, is not owned anymore by his government, by his country, or even an ownership structure from his country, but owned by Chinese investors. Yeah? And therefore, quite sure, this company does not represent this Portuguese, yeah, in this case, Portuguese interests. Yeah? And therefore, in a bottom-up process by the ANSWERs, so clearly more not the Chinese interests come up, yeah, but maybe purely financial interests, yeah, and this goes wrong. And to give trust to these bodies, yeah, the ANSWERs should fulfill very high-level criteria of transparency, yeah. They should be neutral, impartiality, yeah, and also a certain level of guarantees independency. In the same way as this is foreseen, like I mentioned, this for the role of ITOs. Yeah? If the if the ANSWERs would be completely ownership unbundled, yeah, from the TSOs, I think there would not be a problem. But I think the logic of usual unbundling issues, yeah, also applies here, and we could use some elements from that also to addressing and solving and to increasing trust in those bodies and make them more effective, efficient, and European. Yeah, by introducing those aspects as well.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I think we can close this session on governance. As you saw, we selected a few issues, but I remind you that they fall and they are related to the upcoming legislative proposals. So I think this is the good context and the timing discussion. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a question. One more question. Can I ask still my question? Well, my name is Ulrike Gira. I work for E-Control, for the Austrian energy regulator. And I have a question towards ACER. The peer review decision was already mentioned several times today. And my question is, ACER's position towards a code of procedure, towards procedural rules, because if ACER wants to adopt more binding decisions or recommendations or opinions, then in e-control's point of view, it needs a code of procedure, procedural rules, because if we as a national regulator adopt a binding decision, then we are bound by administrative procedural rules. So we have strict procedural requirements we have to fulfill. And at the moment, in my point of view, ACER cannot guarantee those fundamental procedural rules. So I would be curious to hear ACER's point of view on this point. Thank you.
I think there's no disagreement on principle on this one. I think we're in favor of procedural rules to the extent necessary. We have quite some rules already, but probably a bit less strict than what you're used to at national level. And for us, of course, it depends also a bit on the outcome. If the outcome is an opinion or a recommendation, the rules can be a bit looser. Once it becomes a decision and open to appeal, the rules have to be stricter and they have to be very clear and we have to adhere to them. So if you move from, let's say, a recommendation to a decision, there should be stricter requirements in terms of procedure, in terms of making sure all the parties are heard in the process and there is a possibility for appeal with a proper way to reconsider the case. And I don't see any disagreement on principle there.
Okay, thank you very much. We now close this session.